Okay, so now I want to return to the complex aspects of U.S. foreign policy after the Gulf War. After the Cold War, sorry. And I want to talk a little bit more about 9/11, the tragedy then, um, the build-up to the war in Iraq with George Bush, where we are now, even with Obama, and really to kind of sum up some of my arguments that I'm trying to make. So, I just kind of browse, I put on Google Bush and Saudi king, and so here's a picture. Sometimes you'll find doctored up pictures on internet. You should always be careful, but there's plenty where George Bush is in a very cozy circumstance. And in the Middle East, it's common for men to hold hands, and it's not considered effeminate by any means. And so, of course, George Bush is blending right in. But the U.S. has had a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia for a long time, and here's, Obama, same thing. And so, Saudi Arabia is one of the most strict Islamic countries in the world. I have a relative who's been there for years working privately, kind of like a butler. His job's a little complicated. But for a very wealthy family, and so we often talk about life there. He can't hang out with women. There is public executions. Many educated Saudis that get a Western, go get to a university here, would like to see reforms. So definitely, it's not all that are feeling that way, but ultimately, the Saudi Arabian government is one of the most extreme and strict of all the Islamic countries in the world, and even ISIS. Their ideas are very much influenced by Saudi Arabia. And, Iran is the other big, strict Islamic government, but we always talk about human rights abuses over there. We don't really talk about it or hear much about Saudi Arabia. And so, it's just kind of interesting, right? What is it our issue then, right? Are we pro-Islamic governments, or are we not pro-Islamic governments, or what's like, how do we make sense of what seems to be very inconsistent? So let me back up for a little bit and just kind of address several things. So we get to the tragedy of 9/11. And I remember I was going to Modesto Junior College that day, going to math class. And for some reason, MJC did not just end classes. I think we're all a little bit of shell shock. And I remember going, and we were all like stunned. And my professor was trying to teach math, and then he just stopped and he goes, "What's going on?" And it was just a weird thing. I think it just kind of threw off. Everybody had very different reactions to it. Sometimes George Bush is kind of criticized because he was reading a kid's story at an elementary school when it happened, and he just kept reading, and some people criticized him. I haven't necessarily been free of criticism of George Bush, but I think in this case, I feel like a lot of us were like that, where it's just like, did this really happen? We're kind of almost like in a dream or something. And so you have this terrible terrorist attack happen. Now, keep in mind that we had Timothy McVeigh. Prior to this, one of our worst terrorist attacks was from a U.S. Gulf War vet who first learned how to blow up buildings when he fought in the Gulf War, and then he was angry at the U.S. government, and he, just look up Timothy McVeigh. I don't have time to cover everything, but that was a domestic terrorist act that was by a Gulf War vet. And I'm not meaning that to like kind of poke at the term. When I say Gulf War vet, I'm just merely trying to point out that wars are supposed to make us more free. And sometimes you have soldiers. Most soldiers, of course, would not support that or act that way. But in this case, there was a weird irony, if you want to put it, is that you had, with the Timothy McVeigh case in the Oklahoma City bombing, American citizens being targeted getting hit by him. And he was originally trained in the Middle East, but as a soldier. So there's some irony there, and there's some maybe food for thought to look into. But in any case, 9/11 is one of our worst, if not the worst, of course, right, domestic terrorist acts. And we found out it was the people who took credit for it were a group called Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda in Arabic means the base. And it's not quite clear what base it meant or where the beat, but it was that was called, and it was located the base in Afghanistan, and nobody on 9/11 was from Afghanistan, nor were they from Iraq. They were from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Two major allies of the U.S. government. Now, they weren't government agents; they were citizens from them. But it's very interesting. Remember, I think I told you that Egypt's the second largest military aid recipient. We see very clear in these pictures the long, very close relationship of the U.S. government with Saudi Arabia, whether it's Democrat or Republican. And those are citizens from those countries that did 9/11, and they were rooted in a group in Afghanistan. Now, how did this group originally get in Afghanistan? It goes back to that Soviet invasion, that video I just had you watch, fighting the communists. And bin Laden was from Saudi Arabia, and he got politicized and helped fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets when the U.S. was in favor of that. And the Taliban, which were ruling in Afghanistan, they allowed basically Al-Qaeda to stay as guests. It could be more complicated than that, and I haven't really read a full analysis of the exact relationship of what they would have known or not known about 9/11 or not. But I mean, political leadership and so forth. But Bush gave an ultimatum and told Afghanistan, listen, you give up bin Laden and some of these Al-Qaeda officials, or we go to war with you. And they didn't give them up, and the U.S. Promptly bombed Afghanistan for that reason. And then an occupation started there, which still goes on to this day. This is the longest war that we've had in our history. It's not that it hasn't took the greatest toll on U.S. soldiers, let's say like the Vietnam, but it's the longest war we've been in so far, us having troops in Afghanistan. Okay, and then Bush made the case to go to war with Iraq almost immediately. And what was shocking about this is that Iraq had no ties to 9/11. You can look up on Google. It doesn't take very long at all, or watch YouTubes where Bush admits that it didn't. Then he said, well, they have weapons of mass destruction, and after 9/11, we can't tolerate any kind of potential threat to U.S. interests. He has these weapons of mass destruction that we know he must be accumulating, means that we should attack Iraq. And many people in the world, half the country and the majority of the world, said that why would we attack a country that did not attack us or have any involvement in terrorism? And this was called the Bush Doctrine. And Bush said, but this preemptive war will protect us. And Condoleezza Rice said, do you want the smoking gun to be a nuclear bomb cloud? In other words, there was this idea that, if we sat around after 9/11 being passive with dictators who are not friendly to the U.S. government like Saddam, then we have only ourselves to blame in a sense if we don't take them out now. And then he did this also under this premise that was with members like Dick Cheney, the very guy I showed you in the clip, his vice president, who claimed why it was so wise not to go to war in Iraq, to overthrow Saddam in the first Gulf War, changed his tone and now is like really pressing for it, saying that democracy is the best thing to make us secure. And Bush often said democracies don't go to war with each other. By the way, North Korea is officially called the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and he saw them as evil access. North Korea calls itself a democratic republic, but right, can't always trust labels. Anyhow, that was what we were told, and that was the push. And part of this was, and the neocons, as they were called, the conservatives, and these are not traditional conservatives, by the way. There was this idea that because the Soviet Union fell, and that we've had unprecedented military power, that with this surplus, to not use it when it could be to our advantage. In other words, that major surplus of military power, meaning that we're the world's last superpower with no real competition coming from nation states. And do not think that China is our equivalent, or Russia. The nuclear bomb thing, that makes the problem. That kind of equalizes things a little bit. Okay, but in terms of like actual global dominance militarily and just what we have, there's really not anyone to compare to us. And just kind of research military spending of what the U.S. government does compared to other nations. We spend about as much as the entire world combined. Just look it up. Just look it up. Find some credible sources, CIA sources, whatever. Anyhow, so then this idea was, we could make it a world a safer place. I mean, this was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, not American freedom. So this was also kind of promote that old idea that we could be a moral good through our policies, even if it's by force, a war. Well, what ends up happening is that no weapons of mass destruction were found, as Bush and Powell, if you also look them up, they're quite embarrassed about, but they still defend their position on going to war. And everything that Cheney predicted in that first clip that I showed as to why it would be a problem to, the problem of removing Saddam, having Iraq split up into many pieces, and not knowing what would come up, and more soldiers dying than necessary, and all those things seem to be the case. Now, I'll let you make the judgment, but it seems like Cheney won, which was contradicted by Cheney as a vice president of Bush. I don't know. I'm persuaded by the arguments of Cheney the first time in his first clip, and not the one that promoted this where we're at now. Now, in any case, we're all going to have our own opinions, and it's a sensitive topic because so many loved ones have fought from the U.S. government. I have friends, I know people, we have had students who fought in Iraq. It's a very sensitive topic, but it's one I can't avoid discussing and kind of bringing up and cracking open, because it's one of the most significant foreign policy aspects that has affected the United States and the world. And I think it's fair to say a good chunk of people who have studied the field that I have and are really knowledgeable of the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy believe that ISIS could have not existed without the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein and the civil war in Syria, which I'm not going to have time to go over that. Now, we've been in this really complex position, and so what has been the case? I mean, what's going on, and how do we get to this again? I want to point out that I told you that in the Middle East there were many that favored Soviet ideas, other ideologies that was not political Islam. In fact, so much so that the U.S. government was horrified and afraid of Islamic countries falling into the influence of the atheistic Soviet Union. Saudi Arabia, not just in their oil, were major supporters around the globe, as they still are now, of Islamic political militant groups that would combat these kind of secular ideologies that the West always says, secularism would be best, separation of church and state and so forth. But in fact, there's been some gamble on the idea of this creating a better, being a better policy. And so I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to have one more lecture to finish up my thoughts on this.